Sherlock Holmes, The Rediscovered Railway Mysteries and Other Stories, by John Taylor, read by Benedict Cumberbatch. The 1059 Assassin. It is now well known that the investigations of my friend and companion Sherlock Holmes, which I have had the privilege to document over the years, represent only a small portion of his life's work. Many other cases have fallen into the obscure well of history. But nothing departs this world without leaving some trace or memory, and now and then an old story rears its head. So it was with the events of the Stovie murder. A letter came to Holmes one morning at our Baker Street apartment from Samuel Carpenter, an elderly publican at the Horse in Colours hostelry in the Kent village of Stovie. Several years previously, Samuel Carpenter had been a witness at the trial of Arthur Weeks, a local villain accused of intimidation, abduction, blackmail, and grievous bodily harm. Holmes had been involved in helping police on the case with footprint evidence, and thus had come to meet the amiable publican. I suppose we never expected to visit the quiet settlement of Stovie ever again, but the letter contained a clear and urgent summons. Dear Mr. Holmes, you did say when we made our farewells 4 years ago that if ever there should be a day when I had need of your assistance, I was to write to you immediately. I'm afraid, sir, that day has come. A terrible set of events has clouded my life, and I am quite at a loss. Arthur Weeks, that ruthless villain you helped put away, died in jail a few months ago. Ever since then his son, Henry, has been making our lives a misery. I found my dog Catcher shot dead in the field, and twice a dead fox in our water tank. I started getting letters threatening to burn down the inn, telling me I should one day wait in vain for my wife to come home. Terrible things, but all written anonymous. Then he brazenly come and drink at the inn as innocent as you like. Well, last week our son Jack told Weeks straight there in front of all my customers that he'd gone too far and he'd better prepare himself for some serious consequences. I wish he had not done it. 2 days afterwards, Weeks was found shot through the head, and my Jack is now being arrested as a murderer. If there's anything you may be able to do, Mr. Holmes, please come immediately. I knew that Holmes had taken strongly to the publican, so it was hardly a surprise to me when he asked, as is his way, whether I had any pressing engagements over the next few days, and, when I said no, instructed me to pack immediately an overnight bag. Within an hour we were aboard a Kent-bound train. In Stovie village we took rooms at the Horse in Colours, and as soon as we were settled in, sat with our landlord at a table in the bar, where a large fire battled the chill in the air. Holmes said, "Now, Mr. Carpenter, the first thing you must do if I am to help you is to answer my questions honestly and accurately." "That I will do, Mr. Holmes." "Your Jack made a threat to Henry Weeks here in this bar?" "Yes, sir." "And 2 days later Weeks was found dead?" "Dead with a shot through his head, just outside the village where Nightingale Lane crosses the London railway line, and his horse tied up nearby." "And they came to arrest Jack when?" "That very night. But Jack wasn't here, of course." "Wasn't here?" "Jack couldn't have killed him, Mr. Holmes. Jack was already aboard the London train when Weeks was killed. He was off to buy himself a suit for his wedding. I took him to Stovie station myself that evening to catch the 1059. There weren't a moment when Jack left my sight. I watched him get on that train and waved him off as it left. But the police didn't seem to think that counts for anything. Soon as he got back here next day, they carted him off, and he's now under lock and key in Maidstone jail." "Well, Mr. Carpenter," said Holmes, "I accept unequivocally that what you are telling me is the truth. But my sense is that this is going to be a very convoluted business, and I must impress on you the need to be patient." When Carpenter had returned to serving his customers, I said quietly to Holmes, Surely, if what the old chap says is true, the police have no case. Weeks must have had 100 enemies hungry for his blood, with far weaker alibis than Jack Carpenter. Perhaps so, said Holmes, but I fear the word of a father in defence of a son is unlikely to be regarded in court as compelling evidence, especially when the police have their minds made up in advance. Watson, I've a suspicion that things may get a lot more obscure before they become clearer. Let's make good use of the afternoon by acquainting ourselves with the details of Henry Week's unfortunate end. Our escort to the scene of the crime was a local policeman, Sergeant Berry, a man of stubborn practicality, whose uniform one suspected must have been artfully augmented to accommodate the spectacular rotundity of his belly. He clearly felt he had better things to do than to accompany a consulting detective to the scene of a crime when the culprit was already halfway to the gallows. Walking from Stovie village, we arrived at a spot about 30 yards from a level crossing where the main London railway line traversed Nightingale Lane. "Darkhill Crossing. Corpse found here," Sergeant Berry said bluntly. 6 feet from the fence. Victim's horse still tied to the fence. Cause of death, single bullet entering just here. He put a plump finger in the centre of his brow. "Weapon?" "A gun," said the policeman insolently. "I am aware," said Holmes, clearly irritated, "that if a man is killed with a bullet, then the probable source of the missile is a firearm. What I want to know is whether the weapon has been found, or, if not, whether anyone has deduced the type of gun from the type of bullet." "No gun found," said Berry. "As for the bullet, far as I know, it's still at the end of a short tunnel into his skull." "And the horse?" "Oh, I don't think we can pin it on the horse, sir," the policeman said with a smirk. "Sergeant Berry," Holmes was threateningly patient, "are you able to assist me in this investigation, or would it be more convenient to you if I were to apply to my acquaintances at the Yard to find me an alternative guide?" The policeman looked suddenly chastened. "Just my joke, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I can take you to the horse, sir, and to the body." We saw the horse first. It had been stabled with the police horses in a yard in the village, a tall brown stallion with rather frightened eyes. When young, it must have been a formidable creature. Now it looked ragged from a lifetime of hard riding. Holmes looked it over carefully. The animal was skittish, seemingly distressed, and tried to pull away when Holmes held its bridle to examine its head. I watched rather nervously as my friend entered the stable bay and walked round the animal, which threatened to jostle him against the walls. Then, when he reached the front of the creature again, Holmes said, "There's a mark here. A sharp wound, can you see?" On the right foreleg, just above the fetlock joint, was a slender but quite noticeable lesion, apparently caused fairly recently. Holmes turned to Berry again. "Was this mark here when the horse was found?" "I believe so." "Good. Well, since we seem to be in the business of investigating wounds today, you'd better show us the way to the morgue. Incidentally, Sergeant, how well do you know the accused man?" "Fairly well," replied the policeman. "Do you know whether he has friends, acquaintances, perhaps, of some intimacy?" "Well, not really that I know of, sir. He was always at his father's public house, and they were ever a close lot. I mean, he—" Sergeant Berry stopped. He became instantly animated and businesslike. A gleam came into his eyes, and he said, "Look, there's the mortuary, Mr. Holmes, just after the church. I'll leave you to it, if I may. Just thought of something rather urgent I've got to do." And very briskly, almost running, he disappeared back towards the village. "Strange," I said to Holmes. "What do you think that was about?" "I think," said Holmes, "that I've put an idea into his head. I only hope it doesn't complicate matters." It transpired that a post-mortem on the dead man had been commissioned, but that the police pathologist had only arrived from London that morning, possibly on the same train as Holmes and myself. I knew Professor Yardley a little through my connection with St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, and he was quite amenable to my assisting him with the matter in hand. He was a conscientious practitioner, and while the cause of death seemed evident, he thoroughly inspected the externalities of the corpse before opening it. The head wound was a clean, almost star-shaped hole, glutted with dried blood. There was no wound on the back of the head, and it was apparent that the bullet had not exited the body. "Notwithstanding that there was no weapon at the scene," Holmes said, "suicide seems out of the question, wouldn't you say? There are no powder burns to the skin, and, besides, the wound is probably too small for a close shot. I'd say the missile came from some distance." The bullet had, it turned out, penetrated the brow and lodged deep in the parietal lobe of the brain, but, as Holmes had suggested, the hole in the skull was small, and there was not the dramatic shattering of bone one might have expected from a close shot. Suicide, Professor Yardley concurred, was not a possibility. "We are certainly looking for a murderer, then," I commented to Holmes as we wandered back towards Stovie. "Well, somebody killed Henry Weeks for certain, Watson. But I have to confess that at this moment I have no idea who it was." "You don't think we might be wrong about Jack Carpenter after all?" "I do hope not, Watson. It would be an appalling tragedy. But then I suppose for one poor soul or another, murder always is." I had hoped that our next port of call would be the Horse in Colours, for an icy wind had blown up and I was ready for a glass of beer and the comfort of the inn's blazing logs. But Holmes walked us straight to Stovie Station, where, he said, we must make an important call. I steeled myself against the increasing cold as the last light faded from the sky. The station-master at Stovie was Milton Fraser, a man dressed to give the impression of order and precision, his cap fitting perfectly the balding sphere of a small, neat head, and a fine silver pocket-watch peeping from his waistcoat pocket. Holmes, whose own knowledge of the country's railways is second to none, won his confidence easily. "I wish to ask you, Mr. Fraser," he said, "about yesterday evening. There is a late train to London, I believe." "The 10:59, sir." "It was on time?"
"It was, as it generally is. Not much traffic on the tracks at that hour."
"And do you recall whether any passengers boarded the train at Stovie?"
"Of course I do, sir. Young Jack Carpenter."
"Just him?"
"Yes, sir. His father saw him aboard. I watched the train pull away myself."
"And there is no way anyone could have left the train after that?"
"Well, not here in the station, no, not without my seeing him."
"Not in the station?"
"No. I suppose it might be possible for someone to alight at the crossing."
"The level crossing?"
"Yes, sir. The 10:59 always stops at Darkhill Crossing for a few minutes. Safety precaution, sir. Thornley Bridge over the Stour is considered unsafe for two trains until they finish the repairs, so the 10:59 up train must wait until the 11:04 down has come through."
"And this happens every night?"
"Can't recollect when it last didn't, sir."
"Lastly, Mr. Fraser, can you recall which part of the train Mr. Carpenter boarded?"
"Second compartment of the third carriage, sir. I'm quite sure of that."
"Thank you, Mr. Fraser. You've been more helpful than you know." "I suppose we now have to consider," I said to my companion back at the Horse in Colours, as I stared into the flames of the fire, "that Jack Carpenter shot Henry Weeks from the stationary train." "We must consider it, certainly. Yet I think it rather unlikely. How would Carpenter have known his intended target was going to be waiting there at the crossing? Then what is the significance of the stopping train? Has it any?" "I'm beginning to think it has, but I must confess to being currently unsure in what way."
"Well, let's eat and then sleep on it," I said. But at that moment our cosy evening was horribly interrupted. A young woman, hair dishevelled, came screaming into the bar. "Mr. Carpenter! Mr. Carpenter!" The elderly landlord came rushing in from the kitchen.
"What is it, Sarah?"
"It's Beth Miller. They've taken her in."
"Who's taken her?"
"The police. That Sergeant Berry's arrested her. Says he found a gun."
"What's this?" cried Holmes. "Who is Beth Miller?"
"Beth is my son Jack's betrothed," Carpenter said. "Their wedding is fixed for next month. Beth's a good and honest young woman and gentle as a lamb. I'll see that blasted policeman."
Holmes barred his way and put a hand on his shoulder. "If I'm to help you, Mr. Carpenter," he said, staring hard into the man's wild eyes, "believe me when I say that it will not serve our purposes to be too precipitous. Dr. Watson and I will go straight to the police station and find out what's happening. I beg of you to do nothing before you hear from us." Having received Carpenter's assurances, we made our way out of Stovie to the police station. a thick-walled stone building halfway along to the next village. Once a brewery, it now had the grim air of a medieval lock-up. It would not be exaggerating to say that my friend and I received a cool welcome from Sergeant Berry, whose domain this appeared to be. "Yes, sir, I do have a young woman in custody here, and I can confirm that she has been charged on suspicion of murder." "And can you tell me," said Holmes, "how she is supposed to have committed this crime?" "Well, obviously, sir, we don't know all the details yet, but with a bit of imagination, an intelligent person might construe that she had lured Mr. Weeks to Nightingale Lane on some, shall we say, enticing pretext, lain in wait for him, and dispatched him with a bullet as he tethered his horse." "And," said Holmes, "would this same intelligent person construe that Jack Carpenter had a part in this?" "Well, yes, sir, that person, assuming he was using his faculties, would conclude that quite obviously Jack Carpenter was an accessory before the fact, and therefore equally culpable." "Thank you, Sergeant," Holmes said, "for simplifying what I, in my sluggishness of mind, had considered a mystifying problem. Might it be possible for us to see the prisoner now?" "I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't permit that." "Or should it wait until I have received authority from my good friend Superintendent Wales at the Yard?" The policeman licked his lips, pretended to consult a piece of paper on his desk, and said, "Well, as you say you are a friend of the superintendent, sir, I'm sure 5 minutes wouldn't hurt." We were shown to a cavernous room where rusted iron remnants of the brew-house remained bolted to the walls and ceiling. The large skylight had been set with bars, and there were no other windows. A pretty dark-haired girl of no more than 20 years sat at a wooden table. She reacted to us with suspicion as we were admitted, but no sooner had the constable left us alone with her, and no doubt largely in desperation, she confided in us readily. "Miss Miller, we have a limited amount of time," Holmes said to her, "and you must tell us everything you can about this business." "Yes, sir, I'll try. I think I may have done something foolish, sir." "Foolish?" "I think I were the first to find the body, sir, you see." "Well now," said Holmes, "I had certainly not guessed that." "I planned to see my Jack onto the London train," she continued, "but we was held back at the farm delivering a calf, and I knew I was likely to miss him. The train usually stops by a dark hill crossing, so I thought if I cut along Nightingale Lane I might be able to wave him off. But when I got there, the train was already disappearing across the bridge. Then, a stone's throw from the track, I saw a horse tied up to the fence, and something on the road beside it. When I got up close, I saw who it was, Henry Weeks, covered in blood, and next to him the gun." "And you picked up the gun?" I asked. "Yes, sir." "Why? Why did you not go directly to the police?" "Well, sir, because I recognised the gun. I meant to hide it somewhere. It was Jack's gun, you see." I failed to conceal my shock. "Jack's gun?" "So you took the gun," Holmes said, "because you thought Jack Carpenter might have killed Weeks?" "Yes, sir. That was my fear." "Even though Jack was on the train?" "I didn't know how long Weeks had lain there, sir. It's a lonely place, and he might have been there for hours, so that didn't look good for Jack departing as he did the very same evening. I weren't sure of nothing, Mr. Holmes, except that Jack was likely to get the blame, everyone knowing about the venom between him and the Weeks family." "And what," Holmes said, "did you do with Jack's gun?" "Wrapped it in my shawl, slung it on my shoulder, and took it home to hide it. But I was unlucky. On the way I passed Sergeant Berry. I think he must afterwards have puzzled over my strange burden, for he came today to search the cottage, and that's when I was arrested." "But Holmes," I said, "if the murder weapon was beside the body, doesn't that at least establish Jack's innocence?" "Unfortunately not, Watson. The assumption we had made was that the murder occurred while Jack was on the train. If it happened well before that, I fear that either he or Miss Miller here remain the prima facie suspects." "But I didn't kill Henry Weeks, sir. I swear to God." "I don't believe you did, Miss Miller. But we have to convince the police of that. Be hopeful. But as we walked back along the lane that evening towards Stovie and the horse in colours, Holmes seemed somewhat less certain. I have little to go on at this moment except instinct, Watson. I do not feel that Jack Carpenter killed Henry Weeks, and I feel even more strongly that that young woman did not do it either. But feelings, I'm afraid, are not evidence. Let's hurry back to the inn and hope the bar is still available to us. Then we can make an assessment of these matters in comfort. The inn was closed to customers when we arrived, but Mr. Carpenter hastily provided us with a bottle of whisky and some bread and cheese. The fire was still glowing bright, and I sat there for a good hour while my friend went away to ask some questions of our host. Eventually, he returned and reclaimed his seat beside the fire. Can we number the suspects in this case, Watson? Well, apart from Jack Carpenter and the girl Beth Miller, I said, dropping my voice, I suppose Jack's father, our landlord, is another possibility. Yes, and since we know he saw Jack off onto the train, either he or his son would have needed to commit the murder some time earlier. But how early? I've just spoken to him at length. He assures me, and I believe him, that there are plenty of people prepared to swear that both he and Jack were here all afternoon, and Beth spent the day at farm work. Even so, if the police go ahead and prosecute a case against one or all of them, there's a strong chance a jury might find them guilty, based purely on the assumption that they would at some time have had the opportunity. We are not out of the woods yet, Watson. I see what you mean. Our inquiries seem to have stalled, rather. I refilled our glasses from the whisky bottle, and Holmes puffed at his pipe. Then suddenly he said, "The secret is on that train, Watson. I'm sure that's where it is. What time is it? 20 minutes to 11. Come along. We might just get there before it leaves." It was an old cart that transported us post-haste along the hold and muddy lanes of Stovie, so that we arrived at the station splattered and not a little shaken. We were, however, in good time to meet the 10:59. Unfortunately for us, the station master, Mr. Milton Fraser, was again on duty. Despite his obvious respect for my friend, however, he became instantly resistant on hearing Holmes's request. "No, sir. I'm afraid I most definitely cannot hold up the 10:59 London train. Mr. Fraser, this is no flippant request. An innocent young woman will spend tonight locked in a dungeon, as will her fiancé, unless I am able to complete certain essential inquiries. I ask only for 10 minutes. Mr. Holmes, my reputation may be a small thing by the world's standards, but it is very important to me. 10 minutes is a long time to delay a train. But if I can guarantee you that this will not affect your reputation, can you really do that, sir?" "Mr. Fraser, you have my word on it." A long, thoughtful pause. Then, "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I'll do as you ask." When 2 minutes later the great black locomotive hauled its clanking carriages into the station, Mr. Milton Fraser went straight to the footplate and had words with the engineer. A wave to Holmes and myself, who were some way along the platform, told us all was clear, and we boarded the train. Holmes went directly to the second compartment of the third carriage, which contained just one late passenger, an elderly gentleman sitting beside what I saw immediately to be the medical bag of a general practitioner. "If I may interrupt your peace and quiet, sir," Holmes said, and having outlined his reasons, asked, "Were you aboard this train last night?"
"I was," said the older man. "I take this train pretty well every night. I'm a medical man with a practice in Newbury and a home in London."
"Were you in this same compartment last night?" The elderly physician laughed.
"Creature of habit, sir. Same compartment every night."
"And do you recollect the young man who, I believe, got onto the train at this station yesterday?"
"I do, as a matter of fact. He sat there, right opposite me by the window. Pleasant young man."
"Good. Now, sir, the train stopped at Dark Hill Crossing a little way up the line. Do you recall anything unusual about that?"
"Oh, it stops there pretty well every night, but, well, I do remember something, as a matter of fact. The train whistled, as it usually does, to see if the down train is close enough to respond. At just that moment, I remarked a small flash of light outside the train, like the sun reflecting off brass.
And the young man, said Holmes. What was his response?
He seemed as puzzled as I was. He said he knew the area and couldn't imagine what it could be.
Thank you, Doctor, said Holmes. He led me briskly from the train. We have just 3 of our 10 minutes left before the train leaves, Watson, but I think it might just be enough. Mr. Fraser was waiting for us on the platform. All done, sir? One final request, Mr. Fraser. Are these the same carriages and in the same order as made up the train last night? Yes, sir. That doesn't change much. Then I'll need to get onto the line to check the other side of the train. I don't know, Mr. Holmes. The down train is due. You'll be at too much risk. I shall be quick. And without further discussion, he re-entered the train, crossed the compartment, opened the further door, and dropped onto the down line beyond. At almost precisely that moment, we heard a whistle, and Fraser said, "By golly, Dr. Watson, that's the down train crossing the bridge." I waited for a half-minute, but when I heard the rumble of the approaching train, I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes!" I called. "Get a move on, for God's sake!" But the last words of my sentence were drowned by the roar of a locomotive thundering into the station and hissing to a halt next to the 10:59. I'm not sure what I thought had happened. I could see that Holmes had not regained the empty compartment for a terrible moment. I hovered in a cloud of anxiety. Then his head appeared, between the bottom of the train and the platform edge. He had ducked under the stationary train to avoid the incoming express. "Holmes, are you all right?" "More than all right, Watson," he said as he clambered back onto the platform. "Especially as I believe I can now name our murderer." He turned to the rather shaken station-master. "The train may leave, Mr. Fraser, but there are conditions. I see there are no facilities for uncoupling a carriage here in Stovie." "Correct, sir. There are no sidings here." "Then I must ask you to travel to London with the train, and to ensure on arrival that the carriage in which the physician gentleman is travelling is impounded at Paddington." "Good Lord, Mr. Holmes! Is the doctor a suspect?" "No, Mr. Fraser. But one might say the carriage is." Despite his misgivings, the station-master was heroically compliant, and directly he had arranged for a message to be sent to his own family, he boarded the 10:59, which had now, for one night only, become the 11:25, and the train pulled out of the station on its way to London. "Well, Holmes, I probably don't need to tell you," I said, "that I am completely baffled." "You can be forgiven for that, Watson. It has been a puzzling business. But you do intend to explain to me how a train carriage can be a suspect in a murder case. I will explain everything when we get back to the Horse and Colours, but first I must ensure that Beth Miller is released from that appalling prison and spends tonight in her own bed." It was long past midnight when we sat again in the comfort of the inn. Though I had not been present when Holmes had put his theory before Sergeant Berry at the makeshift jail, he had clearly made a convincing argument, because Beth Miller had been immediately released and sat with us now at the rough-hewn table where Samuel Carpenter, bubbling with the turn in fortune, was proving very liberal with his best ale.
"So, who was it, Mr. Holmes? Who was the murderer?"
"Well, that's not as simple a question to answer as you might think," said Holmes. "The simple answer is that Henry Weeks was the murderer." "Do you mean it was suicide?" I said. "Well, Watson, whatever we call it, there is no doubt that when Henry Weeks fired the gun, it was to murder Jack Carpenter." Around the table, Mr. Carpenter, Beth Miller, and I, all wearing similar baffled expressions, sat staring at Holmes, waiting for him to elucidate. "Henry Weeks," Holmes said, "went to the spot with the intention of killing young Jack. He knew the train would stop there, and he meant to get a shot at his victim through the carriage window. Things seemed to be going well for him.
Jack Carpenter was sitting on the Stovie side of the train, so Weeks would have had a good view of him from the lane. Here is what I believe happened. Weeks took aim, but at the very moment he was about to squeeze the trigger, the train blew its whistle. My guess is that the horse reared up and kicked the butt of the gun, hence that wound on the beast's foreleg. The gun went off. "Ah," said I, "that flash of light the physician on the train mentioned." "Precisely. The sound of the shot was probably drowned by the noise of the train. The gun barrel now tilted down, its aim sent low. The bullet hit the wheel bogie of the carriage. The mark on the metalwork is what I was so keen to check this evening, and ricocheted back to strike Henry Weeks." "So the train wheel was the killer," I said. "As I say, one could impute the train or the bullet or even the horse as accessories, for all were material in the death. But the fact of the matter is that Henry Weeks, in a rather elegant example of poetic justice, inadvertently murdered himself." Holmes and I took the first train back to London the following morning, passing on our way out of Stovie Station the sight of Weeks's lonely death. "What put you onto it, Holmes?" I asked. "I suppose you could say, Watson, that human goodness put me onto it." "Not deduction, then?" "Samuel Carpenter, his son Jack, Beth Miller. Good people, Watson. We were, if my instinct about them was correct, distinctly short of homicidal candidates. Then you'll recollect the nature of Weeks's head wound. Clearly not suicide, as you noted yourself, because of the shallow nature of the wound. But was it a deep enough lesion to have been caused by a direct hit at close range? That set me wondering about whether the bullet might have rebounded. My examination of the train confirmed it." "You're quite right about the wound. I dare say it didn't kill him outright. The poor man probably lay there for some while, bleeding to death in the cold." "Well," said Holmes, "perhaps that bleak hour may have given him time to reconsider the error of his ways." Sherlock Holmes, The Rediscovered Railway Mysteries and Other Stories, was written by John Taylor and read by Benedict Cumberbatch. It was produced by Fiction Factory and is published by BBC Audiobooks.